The house is sold, you're homeless now." My mother-in-law said it like she was announcing the weather. Calm, cold, satisfied. She stood beside my husband on our front porch, holding a stack of divorce papers against her chest, while the late afternoon Colorado wind pushed strands of silver hair across her face. Daniel wouldn't even look me in the eye. I remember staring at both of them from the driveway, still holding my purse, still smiling from what had happened less than an hour earlier. $7 million. My grandmother Eleanor had left me $7 million and her estate in Aspen. I had spent the entire drive home crying happy tears behind the wheel like some foolish teenage girl. I kept imagining Daniel lifting me off the ground when I told him. I imagined us finally breathing again after years of financial stress. Instead, my husband stood on the porch beside his mother like a stranger waiting to evict a tenant. "The movers already came," Patricia continued. "Your things are in storage." I blinked slowly. "What?" Daniel finally spoke, but his voice sounded rehearsed. "It's over, Claire. Over." 27 years of marriage reduced to 2 words spoken by a man who once drove 6 hours through a snowstorm just to bring me soup when I had pneumonia. I looked past them toward the house. Our house. Or at least the place I had believed was ours. The flower pots I planted in spring were gone. The porch swing Daniel built 10 years earlier was missing too. Even the curtains had changed. That's when I realized this hadn't happened suddenly. This had been planned. Carefully. Quietly. Probably for weeks. Maybe longer. Patricia stepped down one porch stair and held out the papers toward me. "You should sign while things are still civil." Civil. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked the question that mattered most. "When were you going to tell me?" Daniel rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. "Claire, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder. I thought about the leather folder still sitting in my car containing the copy of Eleanor's will. I thought about the attorney shaking my hand that morning. I thought about the way my grandmother had smiled during her final weeks whenever Patricia's name came up. Now suddenly that smile made sense. Patricia folded her arms. "You'll land on your feet, women always do." There was something almost impressive about how cruel she could sound while pretending to be practical. I met that woman when I was 34 years old. She hated me before she even knew me. Not openly, of course. Patricia Whitmore was too polished for that. Too country club refined. Too experienced at delivering insults wrapped inside compliments. "Oh, Claire, you're prettier than Daniel's usual type. You're so brave to wear your hair short. You've always been so independent. Some men don't like that forever." Little cuts. Tiny poisons. Year after year. And Daniel always defended her. "She doesn't mean it that way." That had become the anthem of our marriage. Patricia looked toward the street impatiently. "You really should leave before the buyers arrive." Buyers. The word floated strangely in my head. Then Daniel finally looked directly at me. "The house sold 3 days ago." 3 days. 3 days earlier, I had been sitting beside my grandmother's hospital bed holding her hand while she struggled to breathe. 3 days earlier, my husband was apparently selling our home behind my back. Something inside me should have shattered right then. But strangely, it didn't. Because at that exact moment, another memory surfaced. 3 months earlier, Grandma Eleanor sitting quietly at her kitchen table in Aspen while snow fell outside the windows. "Never let other people rush you into signing papers," she had told me. I remembered laughing softly. "Grandma, you sound paranoid." "No," she said calmly, "I sound old." At the time, I thought she was talking about ordinary legal precautions. Now I wasn't so sure. Patricia interrupted my thoughts by shoving the papers closer toward me. "You can sign now or later. Makes no difference to us." Us. Not Daniel. Us. That told me everything. This wasn't a marriage ending. This was an extraction. A removal. And Patricia had orchestrated it. Daniel finally sighed. "The house was under my name, Claire. Legally, there's nothing you can do." That sentence almost made me smile immediately. Almost. Instead, I asked quietly, "You sold it already?" "Yes." "And finalized everything?" Daniel nodded once. Patricia smirked. "You always were too trusting." There it was. The truth. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Contempt. They thought I was weak. Simple. Manageable. The funny thing is, I probably had been. At least until that morning. At least until Eleanor's attorney slid those documents across the desk. At least until I learned my grandmother had spent years preparing for something I didn't yet fully understand. A strange calm settled over me. The kind of calm people get right before a car crash. Or right after one. I looked up at the porch. At my husband. At the woman who spent nearly 3 decades trying to erase me from her son's life. Then I smiled. A real smile. Daniel frowned immediately. What's so funny? I glanced toward the stack of papers in Patricia's hands, then toward the house behind them. Toward the house Daniel proudly believed he had sold. And softly, almost gently, I said, "Actually, the house you sold belonged to." Neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the trees above us. Patricia's expression shifted slightly for the first time all afternoon. Confusion. Just a flicker. But enough. And standing there in the driveway with the sun dropping behind the mountains, I suddenly realized something important. For the first time in 27 years, I wasn't the one about to lose everything. Patricia's smile disappeared first. Not completely. Just enough for me to notice. The confidence around her eyes tightened slightly while Daniel stared at me like he was trying to solve a math problem in his head. "What does that mean?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure myself. Not yet. But I knew enough. And more importantly, they didn't know what I knew. That changed everything. Patricia recovered quickly, of course. Women like her always did. She gave a short, dismissive laugh and handed the divorce papers back to Daniel. "Oh, please," she said, "don't start with dramatic nonsense." But Daniel kept staring at me, because after 27 years together he knew my face. He knew when I was bluffing, and this wasn't bluffing. I slowly walked past them toward the porch steps. Patricia immediately moved sideways to block me. "You can't go inside." I looked at her calmly. "My coat is still in there. We'll ship it." Ship it. Like I was already dead. For one brief second, anger flashed hot through my chest. Not because of the house, not even because of Daniel. Because of humiliation. Because they had planned this carefully enough to pack my belongings before I even came home from my grandmother's will reading. Daniel finally spoke again. "Claire, maybe we should talk privately." Patricia snapped her head toward him immediately. About what? There it was again. Control. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. I suddenly remembered something Grandma Eleanor once told me while we sat together on her aspen porch drinking tea. When a man stops thinking for himself, watch the woman speaking beside him. At the time I thought she was simply being old-fashioned. Now those words landed differently. I stepped back away from the porch. "That's fine," I said quietly. "I don't need the coat." Patricia crossed her arms tightly. "Good." Then she added the line she had probably rehearsed all afternoon. "You should be grateful Daniel is handling this peacefully." Peacefully. I almost admired the audacity. Daniel finally looked uncomfortable. Not guilty. Just uncomfortable. Like a man realizing a dinner reservation might become awkward. That hurt more than yelling would have. Because once upon a time Daniel had loved me deeply. I know he did. We met in 1994 at a 4th of July fundraiser in Denver. He spilled iced tea on my white blouse, spent 20 minutes apologizing, then asked me to dinner before the night ended. He had kind eyes back then. Warm eyes. The kind that made you feel safe. And for years he really was safe. Until Patricia slowly became the third person in our marriage, not openly. Subtly. Always subtly. She questioned every vacation we took. Every renovation. Every financial decision. Every holiday. When we struggled financially after the recession, Patricia suddenly became even more involved. She helped us refinance, helped organize paperwork, helped Daniel manage accounts. Grandma Eleanor noticed immediately. "She inserts herself into your marriage like smoke under a door," she once said. I defended Patricia every time. I defended Daniel too. That's what wives from my generation were taught to do. Protect the marriage. Keep peace. Absorb discomfort quietly. And slowly, without realizing it, you disappear. The sound of a truck turning onto the street pulled me back into the present. Daniel looked toward the road nervously. A black SUV rolled slowly toward the curb in front of the house. Patricia's expression changed instantly. "That's them," she muttered. "The buyers." Interesting. I watched Daniel straighten his shirt nervously while Patricia forced another polished smile onto her face. The SUV parked. 2 men stepped out. One was younger, probably an attorney. The other looked around 70. Expensive coat, silver hair, calm posture. He carried himself like someone accustomed to entering tense rooms without fear. The older man looked directly at me first. Not Daniel. Not Patricia. Me. Then he glanced toward the house. "Interesting timing," he said. Daniel quickly stepped forward, holding out his hand. "Daniel Whitmore. We spoke on the phone." The older man shook it briefly. "Walter Bishop." His attorney opened a leather folder beside him. Patricia immediately shifted into hostess mode. "We're just finishing a family matter." Walter's eyes rested on the divorce papers in Daniel's hands. Yes, he said calmly, I can see that. Something about his tone made my stomach tighten. He turned toward me again. You must be Claire. I nodded slowly. Walter studied me carefully for several seconds. Then he said something that changed the entire atmosphere instantly. Your grandmother spoke very highly of you. Daniel froze. Patricia blinked hard. And suddenly, the air felt different. Walter reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded envelope. Cream-colored. My grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. My heart skipped. Walter held the envelope carefully between two fingers. She asked me to give you this personally, he said, but only under specific circumstances. Nobody spoke. Even Patricia stayed silent now. Walter continued calmly. She said if this house was ever sold without your full knowledge. He paused, then looked directly at Daniel. There would likely be confusion about ownership. Daniel laughed nervously. What confusion? Walter didn't even glance at him. Instead, he handed me the envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. I stared at Eleanor's handwriting across the front. For Claire, if Patricia finally gets her way. A cold wave moved slowly through my body. Not fear. Recognition. Grandma knew. Somehow, she knew. Daniel stepped closer now. Claire, what is this? I looked up at him. Really looked at him. At the man I spent almost 30 years trusting. Then I looked at Patricia. And for the very first time since meeting her, I saw fear behind her eyes. Real fear. Not social embarrassment. Not irritation. Fear. Walter's attorney quietly opened another folder. I believe he said calmly before anyone moves into this property, we should discuss the trust agreement connected to the estate. Trust agreement. Daniel's face lost color instantly. Patricia whispered, What trust? And standing there beside the driveway while evening shadows stretched across the lawn, I realized my grandmother Eleanor hadn't simply left me money. She had left me protection. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the words trust agreement left the attorney's mouth. The neighborhood suddenly felt too quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Wind rustled through the pine trees lining the sidewalk. Across the road, Mrs. Hargrove was watering her roses, pretending not to stare. Daniel swallowed hard. I think there's been some misunderstanding. Walter Bishop calmly removed his gloves. No, he said. I don't believe there has. Patricia stepped forward immediately, forcing a laugh that sounded painfully artificial now. This is absurd. Daniel legally owned this property. The younger attorney finally spoke. Partially, he corrected. Partially. I watched Daniel's face carefully. That single word frightened him more than anything else so far. Patricia noticed too. She turned toward him sharply. What does that mean? Daniel didn't answer. Walter looked toward me gently. Mrs. Harper, would you like to open the letter now? I nodded slowly. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the envelope. The paper smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume, lavender and cedarwood. For one painful second, I forgot the house, forgot Daniel, forgot Patricia. All I could think about was my grandmother sitting alone in her Aspen study during her final weeks, knowing she was dying while quietly preparing for this exact moment. I unfolded the letter carefully. Claire, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. I stopped breathing for a second. Walter remained silent while Daniel shifted impatiently beside the porch. I continued reading. You always believed love could fix dishonesty. That was your mother's weakness too. A lump rose painfully in my throat. My mother died when I was 19. Eleanor rarely spoke about her directly. The letter continued. Daniel is not an evil man, but weak men become dangerous when stronger people whisper in their ears long enough. My eyes lifted instinctively toward Patricia. She looked furious now. Give me that, she snapped. Walter's attorney stepped between us immediately. Number. Patricia froze. Probably not used to hearing that word. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. This is insane. No, Walter replied calmly again. What's insane is selling property connected to an active trust without understanding the legal structure. Daniel stared at him. What trust? Walter exchanged a brief glance with the attorney. Then the attorney opened the folder fully. 6 years ago, he explained Mrs. Eleanor Bennett quietly transferred a protected ownership percentage connected to this property after assisting with Mr. Whitmore's financial liabilities. My mind flashed backward instantly. 6 years earlier, Daniel's construction business had nearly collapsed after 2 terrible contracts and a lawsuit involving faulty roofing materials. We almost lost everything. Daniel spent months panicking about debt collectors' loans and refinancing. Then suddenly, Everything stabilized. When I asked how, he told me Patricia had helped arrange financing. But now another memory surfaced. Grandma Eleanor calling me late one evening. "Don't worry about the house," she had said softly. I handled it. At the time, I assumed she meant emotional support. Now I understood. She literally handled it. Daniel looked pale. "What percentage?" The attorney answered immediately. "Enough to complicate unauthorized sale proceedings." Patricia exploded. "Oh, for God's sake, Daniel, what did you sign?" There were hundreds of pages, he snapped back. "And you signed them without reading. You told me the refinancing had to happen fast." The silence afterward was almost embarrassing, because suddenly the truth stood naked in front of all of us. They weren't masterminds. They were greedy amateurs. Walter adjusted his coat calmly while Patricia's composure began cracking apart piece by piece. She pointed at me furiously. "She knew about this." "I didn't," I said honestly. And I truly hadn't. Not fully. But Grandma had. That realization settled deep inside me now. Eleanor had spent years watching quietly while Patricia maneuvered through our lives like a woman rearranging furniture inside someone else's house. And she planned accordingly. Daniel looked at me desperately now. "Claire, listen, we can figure this out. Interesting. 10 minutes earlier, I was homeless. Now suddenly we existed again." I folded Grandma's letter carefully. "You already figured things out, Daniel. That's not fair?" I laughed softly before I could stop myself. "Not cruelly. Just tired. You sold our house while I was burying my grandmother." Patricia interrupted immediately. "It was legally his house." Walter finally looked directly at her. "No," he said calmly. "That assumption may become very expensive." Patricia's face went white. The younger attorney closed the folder. At minimum, the buyers were not informed about active trust entanglements connected to the property. Daniel looked genuinely sick now. Walter spoke carefully, almost kindly. "My legal team discovered the issue this afternoon during final review." Patricia crossed her arms tightly. "So what now?" Walter glanced toward the house. "Now," he said, "we pause everything before someone makes this worse." Daniel suddenly turned toward me. "You knew this would happen." "Number." "Then why were you smiling?" I looked at him quietly for several seconds. Because the answer had finally become clear. I smiled because for the first time in years, I wasn't trapped anymore. Not financially. Not emotionally. Not inside a marriage where every decision quietly passed through Patricia first. The realization felt strange. Painful. But freeing too. Walter gently motioned toward the letter in my hands. "There's more," he said. I looked back down and continued reading. "Claire, if Patricia is standing nearby while you read this, then I imagine she still believes money makes people powerful. But real power is patience. And people who underestimate quiet women usually regret it eventually." I could practically hear Eleanor's voice saying the words. Patricia looked furious enough to explode. Daniel suddenly seemed smaller somehow. "Older?" Walter spoke softly. "Your grandmother asked me to help if necessary." "Why?" I whispered. Walter smiled sadly. "Because she loved you." That nearly broke me. Not the money. Not the house. That. The simple certainty that someone saw everything happening around me for years and cared enough to prepare for it. Daniel stepped down from the porch finally. "Claire?" I held up one hand gently. "Number?" He stopped immediately. And for the first time since our marriage began, he actually listened. Walter suggested we continue the conversation somewhere private. Patricia objected immediately. "We are not sneaking off to some back room over made-up legal nonsense." Walter didn't even react. He simply turned toward me. "Claire." It struck me then that nobody had asked what I wanted in a very long time. Not really. Daniel usually decided. Patricia always influenced. And I adapted. Smoothed things over. Kept peace. That had been my role for decades. But standing there with my grandmother's letter still trembling in my hands, I realized I was tired of peace that only existed when I stayed silent. "I'd like to hear the rest," I said. Walter nodded once. "There's a hotel lounge about 5 minutes away." Patricia scoffed loudly. "Oh, please." But Daniel interrupted her this time. "Mom, stop." The word startled both of us. Mom, not Patricia. Not mother. A little boy's voice hiding inside a 70-year-old man. Patricia looked offended. Daniel looked exhausted. The younger attorney handed Walter another folder while I slowly walked back toward my car. Daniel followed me halfway down the driveway. "Claire, wait." I stopped but didn't turn around immediately. His voice softened. "You know I'd never intentionally hurt you." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. The careful wording. Not, "I didn't hurt you." Just not intentionally. I turned slowly toward him. You sold our house while I was at my grandmother's will reading. His shoulders sagged. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. How was it supposed to happen? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because there was no answer that didn't sound ugly. Patricia suddenly called from the porch. Daniel. One word. Sharp enough to cut rope. And like instinct, he looked back at her immediately. That told me everything I needed to know. Again. The hotel lounge was quiet and dimly lit, mostly older couples eating early dinners, and tourists escaping the evening cold. Walter reserved a private corner table near the fireplace while his attorney spread documents carefully across the polished wood. Daniel sat beside me automatically. Patricia sat beside him even faster. Like she was afraid physical distance might weaken her control. I kept Grandma Eleanor's letter folded tightly in my lap. Walter removed his glasses. Before we continue, he said calmly, I want to clarify something. Nobody interrupted him. The sale itself may not be completely invalid. Patricia immediately smirked again. But Walter continued. However, depending on intent, disclosure, and timing, several serious legal complications exist. Daniel rubbed his forehead. What complications? The younger attorney answered. Failure to disclose protected trust interests, potential financial concealment during marital dissolution proceedings, improper transfer timing. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. You lawyers make everything sound dramatic. The attorney looked directly at her. No, ma'am, courts do. That shut her up for a moment. Walter turned toward me gently. Claire, your grandmother requested that this second envelope only be opened if you discovered evidence of betrayal involving the property. My stomach tightened. Second envelope. Of course there was another one. Eleanor had always believed important things deserved layers. She once wrapped my Christmas gifts inside 5 separate boxes just because she enjoyed suspense. Walter slid the envelope toward me. I stared at it silently. My grandmother's handwriting again. For Claire, when the truth finally becomes impossible to ignore. My chest hurt reading that. Because deep down, I think part of me always knew. Not about the house. Not about the divorce. But about Daniel slowly disappearing from our marriage year after year while I pretended not to notice. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was another handwritten letter. And several photocopied documents. Bank transfers. Property records. Emails. I looked down at the first sentence. Claire. If you are reading this, then Patricia finally overplayed her hand. Patricia shifted uncomfortably beside Daniel. I continued reading silently for several seconds before my breathing slowed completely. Then I looked up at Daniel. You used my inheritance from my mother. He blinked hard. What? I lifted one of the documents. You told me we used your savings during the recession. Patricia suddenly leaned forward. Claire, now wait a minute. Number? The word surprised even me. Patricia froze. I stared directly at Daniel. You used the money my mother left me. He looked trapped now. Cornered. Like a tired man who suddenly realizes every locked door around him was built by his own choices. It was temporary, he muttered weakly. How much? Silence. How much, Daniel? Finally. Almost all of it. The fireplace crackled softly beside us. Somewhere across the lounge, silverware clinked against plates. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing while mine quietly cracked open. My mother left me $80,000 when she died. Not enough to change a life, but enough to matter. Enough to remember her by. Daniel reached toward me carefully. Claire, I was trying to save the business. Patricia immediately jumped in. And that business fed you for years. Walter calmly slid another document across the table. Actually, he said the business losses accelerated after several withdrawals connected to Patricia Whitmore's investment accounts. The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel slowly turned toward his mother. Patricia's face drained pale. What? Walter adjusted the paper slightly. Mrs. Whitmore encouraged several high-risk investments during the same period Mr. Whitmore claimed financial hardship. Daniel stared at her. You said those accounts were protected. Patricia snapped instantly. They were supposed to be. Supposed to be. There it was, the truth finally dragging itself into daylight. Daniel wasn't innocent. But he wasn't the mastermind either. He was weak. Weak enough to follow the loudest voice in the room. Grandma Eleanor had seen that years before I did. I looked back down at her letter. You cannot save people who willingly hand their conscience to someone else. A tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it. Not because of the money. Because I suddenly realized how long I had been fighting alone for a marriage Daniel stopped protecting years ago. Walter spoke softly. Your grandmother didn't want you destroyed financially after the divorce. Divorce. The word sounded different now. Not like death, like release. Daniel finally whispered, "Claire, I'm sorry." And for the first time all evening, I believed he meant it. But strangely, that no longer changed anything. The strange thing about betrayal is this. Sometimes the pain doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes quietly, layer by layer, until one final truth makes everything collapse together. That night in the hotel lounge, I watched 27 years of marriage unravel in less than an hour. And oddly enough, I wasn't the person falling apart. Patricia was. "You're making me sound like some criminal," she snapped at Walter. Walter remained perfectly calm. "I'm making you sound documented." The younger attorney slid another set of papers across the table. Patricia barely looked at them. Daniel did. And as he read, something changed in his face. Shock first, then confusion, then anger. Real anger. Not toward me. Toward her. "You moved money out of the business account." Patricia crossed her arms defensively. "It was temporary." Daniel laughed once under his breath. A bitter sound. "That's what I told Claire." Patricia's eyes narrowed instantly. "Don't start blaming me for your decisions." "My decisions," Daniel stared at her. "You told me Claire would take everything if we waited. And I was protecting you." "No," he said quietly. "You were protecting yourself." That sentence hung heavily over the table. I sat silently beside them, watching the two people who had spent years operating like a team suddenly turn on each other the moment consequences appeared. Grandma Eleanor used to say, "Greed is loyal only until fear arrives." Now I understood exactly what she meant. Walter closed one folder calmly. "At this point, I strongly recommend everyone retain separate legal counsel." Patricia scoffed. "Oh, please, nobody's going to court over this." The younger attorney looked directly at her. "Ma'am, there's already enough here for civil litigation." Daniel went pale again. Patricia snapped toward him immediately. "Stop looking frightened." "I should be frightened." "No, you should stay calm and let professionals handle this." Daniel suddenly laughed again, this time louder. "Professionals, Mom, you told me this would be easy." Every older couple in the lounge was pretending not to stare now. Patricia lowered her voice sharply. "Keep your voice down." But Daniel had finally reached that dangerous, emotional place people arrive at when humiliation becomes stronger than denial. "No," he said, "you pushed this." Patricia leaned closer. "And who signed the papers?" "You said Claire would never know. You said the trust wasn't important. You said the house was safe. You said a lot of things." Each sentence came out harder, sharper, years of obedience cracking open all at once. And suddenly I saw something clearly. Daniel had spent his entire life trying to earn Patricia's approval. Even now, even after everything, part of him still wanted her to tell him this would somehow be okay. But Patricia wasn't comforting him anymore. Because frightened people stop protecting others. They protect themselves. I quietly folded Grandma Eleanor's letters and placed them back inside my purse. Walter noticed. "You all right?" I nodded slowly. And surprisingly, I was. Not happy. Not untouched. But steady. For years I thought losing my marriage would destroy me. Now I realized something worse had already happened long ago. I had spent decades shrinking myself to keep that marriage alive. The destruction had already happened. I just hadn't called it by its real name. Daniel turned toward me suddenly. "Claire, please say something." I looked at him carefully. At the man who once danced with me barefoot in our kitchen at midnight. The man who held my hand at my mother's funeral. The man who now sat trapped between guilt and fear while his mother silently calculated escape routes beside him. "What do you want me to say?" "That I'm sorry." "You already said that." "I mean it." "I know." That seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. Because guilt feels manageable when the other person screams. Quiet acceptance feels final. Patricia abruptly stood from the table. "This conversation is finished." Walter remained seated. "No, ma'am, it's just beginning." She grabbed her purse aggressively. "I am not sitting here while strangers threaten my family." Family. Interesting word. Because Patricia spent years treating me like an intruder inside hers. Daniel looked up at her. "You took money from the business." Patricia exhaled sharply. "Oh, stop acting shocked. I was trying to protect our future." "You hid it from me. I managed it." "That's not the same thing." Patricia looked at him like he was disappointing her. Daniel, weak men always panic once things become uncomfortable. The sentence hit him hard. I could see it. Because for the first time in his life, he realized she didn't actually love him unconditionally either. She valued usefulness, control, compliance. And now that he had failed publicly, her loyalty was evaporating. Walter slowly stood. I think tonight has been emotionally exhausting for everyone. He looked toward me. Claire, my driver, can take you to Aspen if you'd like. Patricia laughed coldly. Of course, send her to her mansion. But the insult landed differently now. Because underneath the bitterness, I heard envy. Real envy. Daniel looked stunned. You're leaving tonight? I nodded. There's nothing left for me here. The words surprised me with their truth, not just the house. Denver itself suddenly felt heavy, filled with memories that no longer belonged to me. Daniel stood quickly. Claire, wait. His voice cracked slightly. That almost hurt more than everything else. Because once upon a time, I would have stayed. I would have explained. Comforted. Tried again. But Grandma Eleanor's final gift wasn't money. It was clarity. And clarity changes people permanently. Patricia grabbed Daniel's arm. Let her go. He pulled away from her instantly. For the first time. Number. Patricia blinked in shock. Daniel looked at me desperately. Please don't leave like this. I picked up my purse slowly. You already left first. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind people remember years later. Walter walked me toward the hotel entrance while the younger attorney stayed behind with Daniel and Patricia. Outside, cold mountain air filled my lungs. The night smelled like pine and snow. Walter opened the car door for me gently. Before getting inside, I looked back through the hotel windows one last time. Patricia was speaking furiously. Daniel sat motionless beside her, not defending her anymore, not defending himself either, just staring at the table like a man finally seeing the ruins of his own choices. And for the first time in decades, I felt absolutely certain about walking away. I arrived in Aspen a little after 2 a.m. Snow covered the long, winding driveway leading toward Eleanor's estate, turning the entire property silver beneath the moonlight. The caretaker, a quiet older man named Benji, opened the gates after Walter called ahead. Miss Claire, he said gently when I stepped from the car, I'm sorry about your grandmother. Those words nearly broke me harder than everything else combined. Because for hours, nobody had spoken about Eleanor herself. Only money, property, divorce, ownership. But Grandma Eleanor wasn't paperwork. She was the woman who taught me how to bake peach cobbler. The woman who mailed handwritten birthday cards every single year no matter where I lived. The woman who once drove 12 hours through a snowstorm after my mother died because she refused to let me grieve alone. And now she was gone. The estate looked exactly the same as always. Warm lights glowing through tall windows. Smoke rising softly from the stone chimney. The porch swing creaking gently in the wind. For one strange second, I expected Eleanor to open the front door holding teacups and asking why I took so long getting there. Instead, only silence greeted me. Benji carried my overnight bag inside while I stood alone in the foyer staring at the familiar wooden staircase. You should get some sleep, he said kindly. But sleep felt impossible. Everything inside me still felt rearranged. So after Benji went upstairs, I wandered slowly through the house instead. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked softly. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon. A knitted blanket Eleanor kept folded near the fireplace remained exactly where she left it. It felt less like entering a mansion, and more like entering memory itself. I eventually found myself standing inside Eleanor's study. Her favorite room. Dark bookshelves, leather chair, soft jazz records stacked near the window. And there, sitting neatly in the center of her desk, was another letter, of course. I laughed quietly to myself through sudden tears. Even dead Grandma Eleanor still had perfect timing. I sat down slowly and opened it. Claire, if you are reading this from my study, then things became uglier than I hoped. I smiled despite myself. That woman knew everything. The letter continued. First, breathe. You have spent most of your adult life carrying everyone else's emotions before your own. That habit will exhaust you if you let it continue. I leaned back slowly in Eleanor's chair. Outside, snow drifted quietly past the windows. Inside, the house felt calm in a way my own home hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. The letter continued. You will be tempted to rescue Daniel emotionally. Do not confuse pity with responsibility. That line landed directly in my chest, because she was right. Even after the betrayal, part of me still worried about him. Not romantically, habitually. Women my age were raised to become emotional caretakers. We soothed, we repaired, we absorbed damage quietly. And after enough years, you stop noticing how heavy that becomes. I folded the letter slowly and stared around the room. Then I noticed something else on Eleanor's desk. A leather journal. My name written across the front. I opened it carefully. Inside were years of notes, observations, thoughts. Little things Eleanor noticed but rarely said aloud. One page stopped me cold. Claire apologizes constantly for things that are not her fault. Another, Daniel watches Patricia before answering difficult questions. Another, Claire still believes love means endurance. I closed the journal gently. Not because I was angry, because I felt seen. Completely seen. And maybe for the first time in my entire adult life, understood. The next morning, Aspen looked breathtaking beneath fresh snow. I made coffee in Eleanor's kitchen while sunlight spilled across the mountains outside the windows. For the first time in months, my shoulders didn't hurt. I hadn't realized how tense my body became living around constant emotional pressure. By noon, my phone began exploding with missed calls. Daniel. Again. And again. Voicemails. Texts. Emails. I ignored all of them, until one message finally caught my attention. Please don't let 30 years end like this. I stared at the screen for a long time, then quietly deleted it. Because the truth was, our marriage hadn't ended in one night. It ended slowly, piece by piece, every time he chose silence over honesty. Every time he let Patricia humiliate me to avoid conflict. Every time I accepted less than respect because I thought loyalty required sacrifice. That afternoon, Walter called to update me. The buyers froze everything he explained. Your husband's attorney is requesting negotiations. My husband. Walter chuckled softly. Sorry, habit. Oddly enough, hearing the word husband now felt unfamiliar. Like clothing that no longer fit properly. Walter hesitated briefly before continuing. There's something else. What? Patricia hired separate counsel this morning. I closed my eyes slowly. Of course she did. She's blaming Daniel. Yes. I sat quietly beside the fireplace while snow fell heavily outside. Then unexpectedly, I started laughing. Not cruelly, not hysterically. Just tired laughter from a woman finally watching years of manipulation collapse under its own weight. Walter laughed softly too. Your grandmother predicted that part exactly. I'm not surprised. After we hung up, I walked outside onto the porch wrapped in Eleanor's old wool coat. The mountain air stung my lungs beautifully. Everything looked clean. Still, honest. And standing there alone in the silence, I realized something important. I wasn't lonely. Not even a little. For years, I confused companionship with safety. But real safety, real peace, comes from not having to earn basic kindness every single day. That evening, as sunset painted the snow gold and orange across the mountains, I finally stopped mourning my marriage, because deep down, I knew I had actually been grieving it for years. 1 year later, I stood in Eleanor's kitchen watching sunlight spill across the snow-covered mountains, while a blueberry cobbler cooled beside the window. The house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Peaceful, warm, lived in. For a long time, I thought healing would feel dramatic somehow. Like a movie scene where everything suddenly makes sense and all the pain disappears overnight. But healing, at least for me, arrived quietly, in small moments. The first morning I woke up without anxiety twisting inside my stomach. The first evening I realized I hadn't checked my phone waiting for Daniel's mood to determine mine. The first holiday dinner where nobody criticized the way I cooked, dressed, spoke, or laughed. Tiny freedoms. That's what healing really was. Tiny freedoms repeated enough times to become a life. Outside, fresh snow drifted gently across the Aspen property, while guests slowly began arriving for dinner. Nothing extravagant, just people who genuinely loved me. Benji carried wood toward the fireplace, while my old friend Marianne arranged flowers across the dining table. Walter arrived carrying 2 bottles of wine, and immediately started arguing with Benji about football. Normal things. Good things. The kind of things I spent years believing would eventually happen inside my marriage if I just tried harder. But some homes never become peaceful because chaos benefits the people creating it. That lesson took me nearly 70 years to understand. Marianne walked into the kitchen, smiling. You look lighter. I laughed softly. That obvious. Yes. She kissed my cheek gently before lowering her voice. Have you heard from Daniel? I nodded once. Twice, actually. The first letter arrived 6 months earlier. Apologies. Regret. Loneliness. The second came shortly before Christmas. Shorter. Sadness replacing excuses. He wrote that Patricia barely spoke to him anymore after the lawsuits began. Several friends disappeared once the scandal spread through their social circles. The construction business eventually collapsed completely under legal debt and public embarrassment. In his final paragraph, he wrote, Your grandmother understood people better than I ever did. I never answered. Not because I hated him. Strangely enough, I didn't. Time had softened the sharpest parts of my anger. What remained was something quieter. Acceptance. Daniel wasn't destroyed by one terrible decision. He was destroyed slowly by years of weakness. And honestly, so was I. Just differently. For most of my adult life, I confused self-sacrifice with love. I believed enduring unhappiness made me loyal. I believed keeping peace made me wise. I believed forgiving endlessly made me strong. But Eleanor understood something I didn't. Love without respect eventually becomes permission. And permission invites mistreatment. The front door opened again as Walter entered the kitchen, carrying snow across the hardwood floor. Bad news, he announced dramatically. Benji still believes the Broncos can recover next season. I laughed harder than I had in years. Real laughter. The kind that rises naturally instead of carefully. Walter smiled warmly, watching me. You know, he said quietly once Marianne stepped away, your grandmother would be very proud of you. That nearly made me cry immediately. Not because of the inheritance. Not because of Aspen. Because for the first time, I finally believed it might actually be true. Dinner that evening stretched for hours. Stories. Laughter. Old memories. At one point, Marianne accidentally burned the dinner rolls and everyone teased her so badly she threatened to leave the table forever. Walter spilled wine on his sweater. Benji cheated at cards. Simple things. Beautiful things. And sitting there surrounded by warmth instead of tension, I suddenly understood what Eleanor had really given me. Not money. Not property. Not revenge. She gave me clarity before it was too late to rebuild my life. That was the real inheritance. Later that night, after everyone left, I stepped outside onto the porch, alone, wrapped in Eleanor's old coat. Snow covered the mountains beneath moonlight. The world looked soft and silent. I sat slowly on the porch swing Daniel built years ago. Ironically, Walter tracked it down after the house sale collapsed and had it returned to Aspen as a joke. I ran my hand gently across the wood. For years I thought home was another person. A marriage. A family. A place where someone promised to stay. But age teaches you difficult truths. Sometimes the people you love most become the people you survive. And sometimes losing the wrong people is the first honest step toward finding peace. The cold mountain air filled my lungs as I looked out across Eleanor's property one final time. Then quietly, mostly to myself, I said, for years I begged people to love me the way I deserved. Now I know real love never asks you to shrink first. The wind moved softly through the trees. Somewhere far below, Aspen glowed quietly in the distance. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at home. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever stayed too long in places that slowly broke your spirit, I hope you remember this. It is never too late to choose peace over performance. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming someone nobody can control anymore. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to share it with someone who may need the reminder too.